Amen.
Thank you so much. And it's a privilege and a delight to be here. And Pastor Nisley assigned me to discuss, to talk about the importance of academic scholarship and research to the professional development of women in ministry. Let me start by saying this. When the Taliban shot down Malala in front of her schoolmates, they were not just trying to deny her education. They were trying to control the message about who she is and what she ought to be as a woman child. The person who pulled the trigger was a graduate student in chemistry. See, limited, if any, education for girls and women, it means they lose control of the message. Who am I? What is my purpose? And how do I fulfill that purpose? Way too often, the answers to these questions emerge from the patriarchal power negotiations that deny women full, if any, agency over their own destiny. And the world is not better off for it. And this is the thing. Even among educated women who never lived the risky life of Malala in Pakistan, even among these, there may be the assumption that we control the message of our purpose and destiny in the human process. But do we? Do we? Do our academic degrees and or the lack thereof reflect a message that is ours? Or is it a message couched in entrenched assumptions that continue to limit our agency? Why are there so relatively few women in ministry still today, 2021, and even fewer involved in related academic scholarship and research? Why? I grew up in the Baptist tradition in Jamaica, part of the World Baptist Alliance, which includes women clergy, and I see Pastor Gina is one of those women clergy. That's how I grew up in that Baptist tradition. So when I entered Seventh Adventist College to study theology, it never occurred to me that that was an extraordinary thing for a woman to do. In fact, when I called the college to decide to apply, the theology chair was a pious elderly man. He actually died the following year. He was so affirming, so encouraging. He said, come along, apply, please. We need more women in the work. I had no funds for my education except for $300 that I'd saved from working for a year with the government of Jamaica right after high school. You see, I was supposed to go to the university to study law, as all my family assumed I would do. And my father was not sure what I, a woman, could produce by studying theology. So he had no willingness, he had no will to help me fund my education. But when I landed on campus, the theology chairman set me up with a job in the campus bookstore managed by his wife. He also connected me to summer canvassing, selling Adventist books door to door, which provided most of the funds for my college education. And in my final year at college, I was asked to teach a general education Bible course, which was a rather extraordinary thing. So when I graduated, the college actually owed me $2,000. That's $1,700 more than what I had when I matriculated 4 years earlier. But this is the thing. No sooner than I had settled on campus, I discovered how offended some of the male students were. They were offended that I had invaded their men's club. Theologians, they called themselves in those days. two of the senior students set up an appointment to speak to me. I suppose they were the delegation from the club, the hitmen sent to shoot me down. They sought to discourage me. They were wondering why a nice girl like me want to study theology. I suppose they were thinking I should be focused on becoming somebody's wife. What are you trying to prove? Who is going to hire you? These were the two questions that today stand out in my mind. They were trying to shoot me down. But I was not fazed. The experience strengthened my resolve. I thought this must change, and this must change. Since then, all that has been occurring in my mind up until this day, this must change. I knew God has called me, and this college experience was a leg of that journey. I never once allowed any of my detractors to control that message. And over all these decades since I've left college, I have always been called to fill a position. And my education up to PhD has been liberally funded. I believe those students who sought to discourage me meant well. But I knew right then and there that they were coming from a dark place in the human process. I have, by the grace of God, risen to the responsibility to be a light into that dark space by staying the course in spite of the many years of tears on this journey. And by the way, friends, I graduated from that college as Theology Student of the Year. And funny, a few years later, when I went to the seminary, I was greeted on registration day by a Black man from West Africa who proceeded to explain to me how disadvantaged I was because I was not only woman, but I was Black. That man went on to become a major antagonist against women in ministry. So now I look back, I see he too was trying to shoot me down. The point here is this, friends. If each time we get discouraged by well-meaning people around us, by votes against us, by exclusion from important decisions that affect us, by hate speeches clothed in evangelistic sermons and scholarly work and whatnot, if every time such things happen, we take up our marbles and go home, how will we ever get to change anything? You see, it cannot be about us. It has to be about a purpose greater than us and greater than those who berate us. Academic scholarship and research is vital for women in ministry. But its importance does not lie in the realization of individual ambition. If this were to be the case, we remain trapped in the cycle in which we do not control the message. Why? Because when one's pursuit in life is bound up in self-interest, it is easy to sell out without even recognizing it. So this is not what we're talking about here. What we're saying is that through academic scholarship and research, we are pursuing a purpose greater than any individual ambition. We are seeking to bring to the world through the church the vital stories of a chronically silenced half of humanity as we pursue God's purpose in the world. So clearly, it is not self-seeking, ambition-driven goal. It is a responsibility to which we are called and to which we must rise. So what does it mean to control the message? Now, the word control can be problematic. I'm not a big fan of the word because it is often, it has toxic manifestations. In fact, it is this toxicity of control that we are trying to mitigate here. So let me explain here what we're talking about. We're talking about agency. That is, we're talking about the extent to which we actually have equal authority in and over all the processes that direct human life. Let us look at these practical examples of how crucial this agency is. Now, here in the Western world, when the legal profession was dominated by males, men could rape women and girls with impunity. You stand before a judge and the woman or the woman child gets blamed or laughed out of court. But today, as more and more women enter the legal profession, it becomes more and more difficult for anyone to get away with even a charge of sexual harassment. When men dominated the medical profession, the major medical research was with reference to men's health, as though women's bodies were microcosms of men's bodies. Now, as women flood the field of medicine, the paradigm is now human rather than male. There is now cutting-edge breast health medicine that focus on individual biochemistry rather than one size fits all. And while this kind of paradigm shift is occurring in all of the intellectual arena with the influx of equal representation of women, it is woefully lacking in the field of religion and theology. Why? You see, religion plays the most fundamental and the most dominant role in human affairs. It is where claims to the voice of God exists. In the case of Christianity, the church, as they say, is the last bastion of male supremacy. It is the very seat of the idolatry of maleness, and it remains the fountainhead of the awful, subtle, and unconscious use and abuse of women. So what we must understand is this: when scholarship in this arena is devoid of non-male representation, it compounds the problem. And what may continue to come out of the academy is scholarship that in no way or in one way or another maintains the overt and covert messages that justify the exclusion and abuse of women in ministry. So let me state here two ways in which we need to assume agency over the message as far as scholarship and research by women is concerned. First, we must address the question: is the sum total of the intellectual content tailored and interpreted to fuel the cycle of privilege? Or is it tailored towards everyone having a seat at the table of conversation about human worth, human rights, and human destiny? Does the content represent the value equally women's experience, women's understanding, and women's contribution? For example, what should a woman's study of Augustine look like? Augustine, the church father? Many may know Augustine for the doctrine of original sin. But what many may not be aware of is that Augustine has been at the root of the misogyny that persists in Christendom. So, shall we simply study Augustine as the average male scholar? Shall we fawn at him without attending to the fatal flaw in his theology? To do that is to perpetuate a message that is not ours and privilege others over us. So the woman must study Augustine critically and reconstructively, and or determine whether any of his teachings is redeemable. But it must be exposed for what it is. Secondly, and therefore, we need to ensure equal representation. For example, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has produced Bible commentaries over the years, but it is almost always male voices. Two recent commentaries attempt improvement. But this is the scope of the inclusion. The Andrew Study Bible, 2019, has 17 commentators. Only one of those is a woman. The Seventh Adventist International Bible Commentary, fresh off the press, has over 60 authors. Only 4 are women. And because it is so dominated by males, how does the female voice escape the maleness of the text? Even scholarship surrounding Ellen White tends to ignore Ellen White as a woman struggling against an all-male leadership in a society where women were still legally properties of males and forbidden to speak in public. Who among these male commentators or scholars, whether they be the liberals who may call her a liar, or the conservatives who often use her as a tool of control, who among these are willing to read her through the lens of 19th century American womanhood? See? Another example of the gender void, the latest study on ordination of women was overly represented and controlled by men. Less than a third of the committee was women. So that the favorable result of that long and expensive study was excluded from the report before the vote in San Antonio. It's as though the study never happened. I just saw on Facebook a promotion, a 7-man panel discussion on the topic, expanding the role of women in Christian worship. The subtitle, A Word from the Lord. These are all men, and the word is from the Lord. And they're discussing expanding the role of women. So the point I'm making here, friends, is that the task ahead is enormous. But with God, all things are possible. So let me throw 2 things at this audience to hopefully and prayerfully motivate a movement and support of women towards academic scholarship and research in the religious theological arena. First, let us be conscious of this struggle. We need to be conscious of the real nature of this struggle here. We start with the Old Testament, legal materials. The Old Testament legal materials reflect the ancient roots of the struggle that we are now engaged in. The woman was not deemed a credible witness. And this stripping away of woman's agency back in the world of the Old Testament was necessary to harness the reproductive capacity of women by rendering them properties of males. It is still happening in church today, and especially in the Black church, where women carry the church on their shoulders, but they have little power in the Black church in general. Read again all those laws on marriage and sexuality, and you see that it is all about male property rights. And we have been told that because the scriptures record something that used to happen in the world of the Bible, it is absolutely right. That's what we have been told. So all that thing is in our heads, that we feel we have no right to be pastors or to be theologians. But if we read the Sermon on the Mount, we will see that Jesus disagrees with all this stuff people take from the Bible to hold others down. We need scholars in ministry in the pew and at the pulpit as much as in the classroom to unplug people's minds from the spell of harmful traditions that have been perpetuated in order to maintain a power structure and continue to this divisive culture of domination. We need women in command of the scriptures. We need women to understand the tradition behind them and how to apply them in wholesome and meaningful ways. We have been closed out of it legally, largely because we do not, let me say that again. We have been closed out of the study of theology and Bible, largely because if we do the study and research for ourselves, we might find out the extent to which the Bible is about liberation rather than domination and control. Even in the New Testament, we see texts that blatantly deny women the authority to teach in the church. In 1 Timothy 2, the author asks women to stop teaching, go home and have babies if you want to be saved. What we need to understand is that such texts are inconsistent with the teachings and practice of Jesus, of the early church, and of the Apostle Paul himself. And so the second thing I want to submit to you is this. I want to submit to you a hermeneutic of suspicion. Use it. What are we talking about here? The term hermeneutics has been defined as a science of interpretation, and most often we apply it to methods by which we determine the meaning of a text. But hermeneutics in the broad holistic sense describes how a message, whether written, oral, or nonverbal, is received by the reader, the hearer, or the observer. And in fact, studies in cognitive science suggest that people generally absorb information passively, with little critical examination. And so much of what goes on in our lives and affects human behavior occurs unconsciously. The reality is that cultural entrenchment often occurs on a subliminal level. For example, few people will dare to ask, why do we not also address God as mother? And few women will stop to examine why people use the term man or mankind to refer to women as well. And so we never get to see how this kind of language continues to diminish womanhood in spite of the progress so far. It's as though the more things change, the more they remain the same. So a hermeneutic of suspicion takes time to examine the intent of the message, the source or sources of the message, as far back as they may go, and determines how to reconstruct it towards beneficial ends. Sometimes the message has to be totally thrown away, but it takes courage and intellectual integrity. Look at these examples of hermeneutic of suspicion. Paul used hermeneutic of suspicion. Jesus used it. In 1 Corinthians 11, 3-12, Paul looks at an unspiritual understanding of gender relations. He takes the male headship argument and he puts suspicion on it in verses 11, 12 of Corinthians 11, where he says, as woman comes from man, man comes from woman, and everything comes from God. What is Paul trying to say? God is the only head, so your headship argument is nonsense. That is what Paul is saying. His hermeneutic of suspicion. We must lead people to read the Bible closely and carefully and boldly, even if it overturns the distorted readings. That is what Jesus did. Jesus said to them, why did Moses command you to divorce your wives? It's for unjust reasons. It is not because it is right, but because of the entrenched traditions that no one dares to challenge. That was Jesus's hermeneutic of suspicion, where he challenges the entrenched ideas. He questions them and challenges them. So now, let us apply this hermeneutic. How can Paul tell women to shut up and go home and have babies if they want to be saved? The same Paul who told women in 1 Corinthians 7 that celibacy was the ideal life if they can handle it so that it can help to finish the work of the gospel. How can this same Paul, who greets so many female colleagues in Romans 16, including Janea, his fellow apostle who was in prison with him, how can this Paul be telling women to shut up and go home and have babies if they want to be saved? Also, at what point in Christian tradition did we come to name 12 male disciples when the gospel clearly points to Mary Magdalene as a major disciple of Jesus? These are examples of a hermeneutic of suspicion that I'm throwing at you, friends. Use it. Question the assumptions that make you hesitate to enter the ministry and to enter into theological and scholarly research. Be bold. I want to give you an example of the slave Bible that you may find in the Washington Museum of the Bible. It excludes 90% of the Old Testament and 50% of the New Testament. Anything that the slave masters thought would encourage the slaves to rebel because it tells them that they are humans like the slave masters. Anything in the Bible, they cut it out and then they give the truncated Bible to the slaves. But why am I telling you this? This editing, this butchering of the Bible continues today. It goes underground. We use the full unedited Bible, but the editing of the Bible continues through interpretation and our selective emphasis. Why are we emphasizing 1 Timothy 2, where women are supposed to shut up and go home, and we don't see all the other places in the Bible where women are leaders and teachers? So we need scholars from among these underrepresented groups, women, white women, Black women, women of color, who know how to critically evaluate the message of a culture in a reconstructive and recreative way that subverts the unexamined hegemonic ideas and ideals of the culture. We need women scholars who have the content foundation, boldness of faith, to lead the church and the culture to wrestle with the problematics of the popular messages that unconsciously hold a culture captive to the systemic injustices of this age. So let me give a personal example of how important this is. Here at Washington Adventist University, we have a Masters of Art Religion program. We have temporarily halted it. But one of the courses I teach in the program is called Readings in Feminist Ethics. The first thing I do at the onset of the course is to dispel the stigma of the word feminist. Because part of the counter-resistance to any movement for improvement of the marginalized is demonization, and they've demonized the term feminist. See, they've made the word feminist into another F word. Of course, they're doing the same thing with the Black Lives Matter movement right now, so watch out. Demonizing. Over the years I've taught that course, only 2 women have been present in that course. Why? Because of the underrepresentation of women in the discipline. But this is what I want to tell you about the course. Without exception, every man that completed that course with me testified to the fact that they feel so liberated. Some of them say, oh, I'm a feminist. One man told me that his wife wanted to know what was happening in the class because she saw this welcome change in his attitude as a husband and father since he started taking the course. And over the decades that I've been a theology professor, I have seen chauvinistic, arrogant young men enter my classes and leave enlightened and liberated. You see, fear and prejudice is a result of the absence of understanding. I care to unshackle these young men because it is mainly as a woman that I can discern how unfree chauvinism makes a person. Through scholarship and research, women must bring understanding to the table to hold back the demon of fear that blocks progress and cripple our creativity. This brings me to the direct question. Why should women in ministry pursue scholarship and research? Let me give you 3 reasons why women should. First, we have to rise to the call of the gospel that has been lost in the wilderness of Roman and European imperialism and American evangelical Christian nationalism that have systematically undermined the influence of women upon the culture. We must estimate the extent to which women purposefully avoid ministry or theological and biblical studies because the scriptures themselves have been used to forbid them. Remember, I just cited to you the 1 Timothy text where women must not teach or have authority over a man. They must be silent. And there's the 1 Corinthians 14:34 text which says women should be silent in the churches. But why have these been the texts that so many Christians resort to when so many others contradict them? As I've said, even headship texts have been contradicted by the very passages in which they appear. The irony here is that these very texts reveal that women were theological teachers and leaders in the early church. That is why the texts are there in the first place. Biblical research reveals that this prohibition against women teaching and ministering in the church is a later development. It's a counter-revolution that developed after the death of the early apostles as the church gradually became more and more Romanized. The 2nd century church father Tertullian was a strident opponent of women who were teaching and baptizing in the church. He calls these women pert and usurpers of the power to teach. One of the major reasons why the Roman Empire hated the church and persecuted it was because of its inclusive nature. This defied the hierarchical system of the Roman Empire. Galatians 3:28. There is now neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male and female, because we're all one in Christ. This is a reflection of the nature of the early church. When Rome infiltrated the church and legalized it into a full-blown religion called Christianity, the church itself became Rome. It became the oppressive empire of Christendom. And this is the problem we face today. So this is the point I'm making. It is not the gospel preached by Jesus and Magdalene and the early apostles that is shutting women out. It is Christendom. It is Christendom, the religion of empire, that is shutting women out. So we have to rise to the call of the gospel that has been lost in the wilderness of Roman and European imperialism and American Christian nationalism. The second reason why we must pursue scholarship and research is that through scholarship and research, we invoke the ideal humanity. From ancient times, religious teachings have been accompanied by significant scholarship that has been passed down to us. The Hebrew prophets, who were the preachers of Israel, had prophetic schools of philosophy that focused on the ins and outs of justice and how it applies to the covenant and the laws. We've been studying Isaiah for a Sabbath school lesson this quarter, but those oracles of Isaiah is a fruit of significant scholarship, research, and philosophical commentary. These schools generated the power to critique the geopolitical structure of the ancient Near East and call them into justice. Jesus and Paul, the two most significant figures in what we now call Christianity, were rabbis, erudite Pharisees, meaning that they were Jewish scholars of tradition and philosophy. Unfortunately, among the ancient philosophers, women were the object of much of their commentary. Much of the scholarship diminished women's worth and intellectual capacity. Aristotle, for example, he thought that women were underdeveloped males, that is, males without, penises. And I keep saying to myself, if Aristotle really thought that, then his intellect has been overestimated, or he's just a plain misogynist. However, this is what we cannot overemphasize. There was significant attempts in the early church to loosen this patriarchal chokehold in the proclamation of the gospel. As I have noted, one of the reasons why the church was persecuted was the church's bold transgression of the gender and class hierarchy that was part of ancient Roman society. And we know of at least one woman who was a student, a disciple of Jesus, Mary Magdalene. And we know that Paul had significant women partners, teachers and apostles such as Prisca and Janea. And this is it. If Christian tradition allows us to hear about Magdalene and these few other women, most likely there were many others. Hermeneutics of suspicion. And this hermeneutic of suspicion has led to deep research by women scholars. And what has come to light, my friends, regarding the deliberate suppression of the history of women in the early church is astonishing. I'll give you some books here. There's Karen Torgeson, who wrote the book, When Women Were Priests, Women's Leadership in the Early Church and the Scandal of Their Subordination in the Rise of Christianity. There's Elizabeth Susla Fiorenza, in memory of her. There's Esther de Boer, Mary Magdalene, Beyond the Myth. There's Sarah Bessie, as Jesus Feminist. And there's Beth Allison Barr, that one is coming out now. It's not quite out yet, but I've ordered mine. Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Woman Became Gospel Truth. So the third reason why we must enter into scholarship is this. Jesus, Paul, Magdalene, and Priscilla is calling out to women to take up again the work of spiritual liberation that comes through understanding, through clarity. They call us to continue the work that has been eclipsed by empire. Right now, the struggle has arrived at a critical place. Many women are either too intimidated by this male stronghold, or they see religion and Christianity and the Bible as an enemy to avoid. The woman pastor, above everything else, must know what she's preaching, what she's teaching, what she's advocating, so that she does not approach ministry with hesitation or fear or apology because she's a woman. Not only do we need women in ministry, but women in ministry need to get into the arena of scholarship and research, I say. The woman's side of the story must be told as well. And that story is diverse. For example, the Black woman, the white woman, the Asian woman, the Hispanic, all have their unique take on the story. But it must all be woman's story, our message, our agency. The church and the world needs to hear that full story of human hopes and aspirations as we try to make our way through what appears to be a never-ending cycle of brokenness and unfreedom. Let me use this seemingly overused, but I don't think overused statement. We are in a battle for the soul of humanity. The task is formidable. But as I've said, with God, all things are possible. Now, I have little doubt that to some I may sound like an angry Black woman, but I do not want to apologize for that. What I want to say is this, that anger, just the anger, in and of itself is a story, an authentic story. If we listen to it, if we study and research it carefully, it can heal all of us. But that is a whole other story. So let me end here. God bless you all.